Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, I'd ask consent that the call of the quorum be rescinded.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I'm going to take, if I can, just a very few minutes to sort of lay out where we are on this efforts to reform the financial structures of our country. It's been a long undertaking, and I won't take a lot of time, and it won't go into great detail, but I thought it might be helpful for our colleagues and others to get at least some sense and a feel for how things are progressing. And so I'll share some thoughts on the major issues that we're grappling with. And I want to begin by thanking the 22 other members of the Banking Committee. It's about 1/4 of the Senate is seated at that table in our Banking Committee hearing room. And I want to thank every member for the work. We've been deeply involved now for well over a year, more than a year and a half, on the issue of how should we shape the regulatory structure, reform it. And we've had, just this year alone, I think, something in the neighborhood of 80 hearings just on the subject matter, listening to a broad range of experts and others who have brought their thoughts and ideas, not to mention the informal meetings that occur outside of a normal hearing process. It's been a very long undertaking and a worthwhile one, trying to examine the causes of this problem that has been so devastating to our country and to others outside of our own country, the economic collapse or near collapse, and to then, from that experience, try and shape a set of policies that will fill in those gaps that led us to this problem, on the one hand, and secondly, try to take the steps so that we're prepared to deal, as we will at some point in the future have to, with another economic crisis as it comes along, to have what I call an architecture or a structure that would allow for our system to be able to respond far more prudently than it was able to in the last couple of years. I should add as well a third goal, and that is to make sure we're creating a structure that not only can grapple with the crisis, but also be a source of innovation, of creativity, for wealth creation, job creation, that our financial services sector had a reputation of accomplishment, or at least helped to accomplish over the years. Those are not inconsistent goals. They're a challenge to balance them, and it's never perfectly right, but our responsibility, both as legislators in this chamber and the other body, as well as the role of regulators and obviously those in the private sector and public sector, is to try and strike that balance between protecting the public and consumers who use financial services, as well as to be able to provide a level of confidence to those who use them that the system is going to be fair. Doesn't mean you're going to get a guaranteed return when you buy a stock, but you ought to feel confident when you deposit your paycheck that the institution is going to be there, or you're going to be protected from losing those resources. So, Mr. President, I'd just like to take a few minutes and share thoughts on where all of this is. I'll quickly add as well, I want to pay particular thanks to the members of the committee. As many people are aware, Senator Shelby and I, my ranking member, have worked closely together over the last 3 years that I've been chairman of this committee on a wide range of issues, and I'm grateful to him for his efforts. He's obviously involved in this debate significantly. I want to thank Bob Corker, a senator from Tennessee, who's a new member of this chamber, but has performed, I think, a tremendous task of trying to sit down and work out the differences. And they are complex and they are difficult, but nonetheless, he has rolled up his sleeves and demonstrated a level of maturity and interest far beyond the years of his service here. And all of us, and I certainly want to thank him publicly as well for his efforts and that of his staff to try and help us get there. Other members of the committee, Jack Reed of Rhode Island, Chuck Schumer, Mark Warner, have taken on particular heavy lifts, and I'll talk about them in a minute as I discuss what's going on, along with Judd Gregg of New Hampshire, Mike Crapo of Idaho as well. So there have been a lot of people involved in this, Mr. President, as we go forward, and I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge their hard work and that of their staffs over these many months. And we're still not there yet. I'm not here to announce an agreement or to tell you we've reached a consensus. We're trying to get there, but we're not there yet. But we're making an effort to see if we can't develop a set of proposals here that would enjoy broad support in this institution as we go forward. So, Mr. President, we've all seen, of course, the devastating consequences, and I hardly need to spend much time enumerating them here. People are living them every day, and they don't need to necessarily hear them outlined, but I'll just share again, what all of us are painfully aware of. 8.4 million jobs have been lost since December of 2007. The unemployment rate, currently at 9.7%, has been obviously far too high, and I think all of us know, I know the presiding officer does, that there are pockets in our country where that 9.7 is maybe half the unemployment rate in certain areas of rural America or urban America. Certainly an astonishing 6.1 million Americans job for a half a year or more in our nation. Millions of our fellow citizens who did nothing wrong have nonetheless lost homes, their retirement security, their jobs, their health care. Small businesses, unable to access credit, have been forced to lay off workers, reduce production, or even to shut their doors, as many have. Working-class families in our country have seen their wealth decline significantly, and worst of all, today we remain entirely vulnerable to yet another crisis. We haven't finished this work, and if something to happen again tomorrow, as much as we've been working on this issue, we haven't passed the necessary legislation that would minimize a crisis bringing us close to the brink of financial collapse as the one we're presently in did. So obviously the status quo, that word, kind of getting tired of using those words, business as usual, whatever you want to describe it as, cannot persist. Congress and I, in my view, and particularly this body, must pass comprehensive, meaningful reform of our financial system. And my hope and intention is to do everything I can in the waning days of my service after 30 years here to achieve that goal. We've got to correct the failures that allowed us to get into this mess that we're in, but we must also develop a regulatory system that is prepared for the next one, and one that's going to invite as well the kind of creativity and innovation that allow for job creation, wealth creation that our system has in the past provided. Over a year ago, the Banking Committee, as I pointed out earlier, set out to investigate the causes of the financial crisis and the vulnerabilities that lie in our financial regulatory structure. Over the last year or more, Mr. President, we've held literally dozens and dozens of gatherings, hearings, informal, formal meetings. We've listened to hundreds of experts in a wide variety of fields that have been either affected by or offer some ideas as to how we can create this architecture I've talked about. And we've examined and re-examined all sets of proposals sent to us by the White House, the Treasury, the Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and others. In November of last year, I offered my colleagues a discussion draft, at least where I was. I didn't suggest it had co-sponsors or backers, but I thought people ought to know where the chairman of the committee was. And so I laid out a broad proposal in these areas. Well, it certainly produced a discussion, Mr. President, I can tell you. Not always a welcome one for certain quarters, but I thought people ought to know at least where I stood on these issues. And if I were going to write this alone and didn't have to need anyone else to offer their ideas and suggestions, I had some pretty strong ideas, I think sound as well, but strong ideas as to where we ought to be. I then asked my fellow committee members, Democrats and Republicans, to work on major parts of the bill. It's so complex and so big and broad, the subject matter, that I didn't think any one member, even a chairman and a ranking member, could necessarily put our arms around all of this. And so I asked various members who had expressed an interest in various subject matters if they'd take on the responsibility, a Democrat and a Republican, working together to see if they could come up with some ideas that would be sound, intelligent reforms of the financial system. It has been an enormous task. And these, as I said a moment ago, are incredibly complex issues. But with the good work done by so many in the committee, I believe we're well on our way to producing a very strong bill. The problems with our economy ran system-wide, Mr. President, and while there's a temptation by some to address only one or two issues and claim victory and call it a day, we are working in our committee on a bill that will attack these problems and vulnerabilities in a rather comprehensive fashion, one that we believe will make a difference. The bill, as we've fashioned this, is designed to achieve four major accomplishments. One, and the first, and I would argue if I had to prioritize them, whether or not the others fall into this category, ending too-big-to-fail bailouts. That, to me, is the most important thing we can achieve here. Never, ever, ever again should the American taxpayer of this country be forced to write a check, which they did, because there's an implicit guarantee that the federal government of the United States will bail out a company lest it threaten the stability of the economy as a whole. will make it undesirable, so undesirable, Mr. President, for a company to get too big or too complex with new capital, new leverage requirements, supervisory requirements, and set up a mechanism so that large, complex companies can be shut down through bankruptcy or resolution in a way that does not threaten the economy or expose the American taxpayer as they have been. Resolution, it is a bankruptcy, it's a receivership, and it is painful to creditors, to shareholders, and to the management who will bear the burden, but not taxpayers. And we're very close to achieving that. And again, I want to thank, excuse me, Mr. President. I want to thank Mark Warner of Virginia and Bob Corker of Tennessee to delve with this issue, this and the systemic risk, which I'll mention in a minute. And they have worked, I don't know how many hours, sitting down trying to fashion this resolution mechanism. But the idea that we'd watch the American taxpayer write out a check for $700 billion, knowing the reaction of the American public. And by the way, in the absence of what we're trying to do here, I think we did the right thing. And had we not done it, I think the financial problem would have been a lot worse. But we never again ought to be put in that position where that's the only alternative we have. This bill will address that issue, Mr. President. Secondly, we create an early warning system in the economy so that somebody is looking out for the next big problem. The bill will create what we call a systemic risk council. That's our goal. They will have the job of looking across the economy to identify unsafe products, activities, institutions that could threaten the economy as a whole in the future. We cannot afford to be caught off guard, again, by obvious weaknesses in our system, because no one is responsible for taking a broad view. Again, not going to stop everything, but we didn't have that ability in the past. And again, Mark Warner and Bob Corker have worked very, very hard on resolution mechanism and systemic risk, and all of us owe them a debt of gratitude for their efforts. Third, Mr. President, we bring transparency and accountability to the exotic instruments, such as derivatives, credit default swaps, things that are rather arcane to most Americans, to put it mildly, but who have been lurking too long in the dark, and were able to cause untold damage to our economy here because they lack transparency and regulation. We change that in this bill. It's our hope, anyway. We get to the conclusion of it. We've got to regulate these activities that left investors and our economy open to the tremendous risks that they didn't even know existed. Billions of dollars, literally billions, being traded and frankly gambled behind closed doors drove our economy to the verge of collapse. Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, Judge Gregg of New Hampshire, and their staffs have been working on this issue over many, many weeks, Mr. President, to try and come up with an intelligent, thoughtful, draft set of proposals on these exotic instruments, particularly derivatives. And I thank them for the job that they've done. And I'm confident when our colleagues get a chance to be briefed about their efforts, there'll be broad-based support for what's included in our bill. We've got to rein in these crazy compensation packages that have outraged the public and hurt companies by rewarding short-term profits and wild risk-taking. Senators Chuck Schumer, Mike Crapo, Chuck Schumer of New York, Mike Crapo of Idaho, and their staffs have been working on governance issues. And more work needs to be done on this, but I want to thank both of our colleagues, again, a Democrat and a Republican, trying to come up with some ideas on governance issues that will avoid some of the problems that we've all too familiar with. And we create, and one that's attracted probably the most attention because of the issues involved, we create a strong and independent consumer protection watchdog, one that's never existed when it's come to financial services. It's somewhat ironic, I suppose, that we have a Consumer Product Safety Commission. So if we buy a toy for our children, or a product or an appliance, and it doesn't work, or it causes us great harm or danger, there's a place called the Consumer Product Safety Commission that'll protect us from these hazardous appliances. And yet when it comes to financial services, we've had no place really to go to get the similar kind of protection. That analogy has been drawn by others in the past, and I think an appropriate one. We have undertaken this effort. It is controversial, Mr. President, because I think there's a lot of fears people have about what we're trying to achieve with all of this. And yet if you look back and you watch what's unfolded over the last couple of years, and particularly where you watch and you see some of these barons of the financial services sector reaping millions of dollars in bonuses after their companies have been shored up through taxpayer efforts. And yet the very people who had their homes, their jobs, their retirement, their health care, their life savings put at risk, what do they get? Having come up with the tax dollars to protect these industries. And so we want to see to it that we never have again the consumer of financial products be unprotected when we start examining these issues. And so we're working at this issue here to put together what I have set out as some principles that should be included in a consumer protection watchdog. A failure to protect consumers, as I think most people know, led to some of the dangerous practices that we saw and put our economy at so much risk. People were given mortgages they didn't understand and couldn't afford, and to ensure strong consumer protection. The real question is, will this office have the independence and the authority that it needs to get the job done to take care of consumers? Mr. President, I focused on 4 principles from the very beginning on this debate involving this consumer protection idea that we hope to produce. 1, it have an independent head, appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by this body, the United States Senate. Secondly, it have an independent budget, so that the office will have the resources it needs to do the job. Thirdly, that it have the autonomy to craft rules to protect consumers. And fourth, an ability to enforce those rules as well. With these features, the office, I think, can act to protect consumers from the kinds of abuses we've seen, such as skyrocketing credit card interest rates, an explosion in checking account fees, or predatory lending by mortgage industry, where rent space is less important. Not unimportant, but less important. What power and authority it has is the critical question. And obviously you want to do this in a way that does not in any way jeopardize the safety and soundness of institutions. And I don't believe there necessarily is any conflict here, although some suggest there may be. So we're trying to provide as well a mechanism to resolve when in fact you may have some conflict between safety and soundness and consumer protection. I understand that concern. We're trying to accommodate that while simultaneously maintaining the independence and autonomy of this agency. Our goal here is to end the status quo, as I said earlier. Words I'm getting tired of using, but obviously doing nothing is unacceptable. And to create a system where honest businesses, large and small, can thrive on a level playing field, where middle-class families can find work, invest with confidence, and achieve the dreams they have for themselves and their children. So today, Mr. President, I'm pleased to report that good work has been done by Democrats and Republicans both on the Banking Committee. And they've put in to put financial reform in a strong position. And while we do not have a bipartisan agreement yet at all, we're getting there. We're trying to. I don't know if it'll happen or not. I'm optimistic it can happen, but I've been around here long enough to know that these things can fall apart very easily. It's fragile. It's complex. Issues that you think you've resolved can produce unintended consequences. And trying to get this, most importantly, getting it right. So while I'd like to get it done soon, I'd make sure we do it correctly and properly. And it's one of the hardest tasks I've ever been asked to undertake in my years here, to try and fashion these proposals in a way that can bring broad support in this institution. So we don't have an agreement yet, but because I've got colleagues like the ones I've mentioned on the Democratic side, like Jack Reed, like Mark Warner, like Chuck Schumer, like Tim Johnson, I go down the list here that have worked on these issues. I also have colleagues like Bob Corker and Dick Shelby and Judd Gregg and others that are making an effort on that side to see if we can't reach those agreements. And I know in the face of everything else you're hearing about Congress these days that nothing seems to be working here. We are making an effort, Mr. President, to come up with a proposal here that will achieve those goals. A good, strong bill, and one that will enjoy good, strong support in this institution. So with that, Mr. President, I hope I haven't talked too long, but I wanted to give you at least a flavor of where things are today. And as I said, we're not done yet. But I think we're in a pretty strong position to achieve a good, strong bill, one we can be proud of in this institution. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Okaka.